All right, so every year the national budget drops, and man, it can feel like a ton of bricks, right? Just huge numbers, big announcements. It's a lot to take in. But that's what we're here for, to cut right through all that noise. So let's get into it and decode the 2026 budget piece by piece. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters, right? I mean, forget the headlines for a second. What does all this actually mean for you, for your job, your community, your wallet? Well, that is exactly what we are going to unpack today. Okay, so first up, let's talk about the big picture, economic growth. The strategy this time around seems really interesting. Instead of broad strokes, the focus is super targeted, zeroing in on specific, homegrown industries. We're talking about really getting into the details to build them up from the ground floor. And when I say specific, I mean really specific. Check this out. We're not just talking about agriculture. We're talking about dedicated programs to turn things like Indian cashew and cocoa into premium global brands. There's also money going into high-value stuff like sandalwood. And it's not just products, it's also tourism, like developing Buddhist circuits and opening new destinations. It's a very precise micro-level approach, all about spotting that homegrown potential and giving it a real push. Now, this targeted approach isn't just for farms and forests. It's also hitting India's powerhouse IT sector. There's a really key change here to something called safe harbor rules. Basically, these are rules that make taxes way simpler for multinational companies. And the big news? The government is dramatically expanding who can use these simpler rules. The threshold is jumping from 300 crore all the way up to 2,000 crore rupees. That is a huge leap, and it's going to slash a ton of red tape for a lot more IT companies. And hey, they're not stopping there. To make things even easier, there's a new common margin. So think about all the different kinds of IT services, software development, KPOs, you name it. Instead of separate rules for each, they're all being grouped together under one single safe harbor margin of 15.5%. The key takeaway here? Standardization. It just cuts out so much complexity and, let's be honest, a mountain of paperwork. All right, so we've talked industry and the economy. Let's pivot now and look at the more human side of things. How is this budget investing in people's well-being? We're going to dive into social support, healthcare, and all the stuff that directly impacts citizens. One of the big focus areas here is empowering people with disabilities, and they're tackling it with a really clear two-step plan. First, you've got the Divyangjan Kaushal Yojana. Think of this as the skills part. It provides job training that's actually relevant to today's industries. Then you've got the Divyang Sahara Yojana. This is the tools part, making sure people get the high-quality assistive devices they need. So it's not just one or the other, it's a complete strategy, skills and tools. And speaking of well-being, there's also a major push to expand mental health care access, which is so important. The focus is really on closing the gaps across the country. For example, North India is finally getting its own national-level institute. Plus, existing centers in places like Ranchi and Tezpur are getting a major upgrade to become regional hubs. It's all about building a stronger, more accessible mental health safety net for everyone, everywhere. You've probably heard about the Lakpati DD program, right? Well, this budget takes that idea to the next level, with a real focus on female entrepreneurship. The plan is to set up these new community-owned shops called She Marks. The whole idea is to give women a platform to scale up their businesses, to go from a small self-help group to a much larger, more formal enterprise. It's a pretty cool concept. Okay, all of these programs sound great, right? But it brings us to the multi-trillion rupee question. How are we paying for all this? Let's switch gears and dive into the nation's finances. Before we get into the big numbers, let's just quickly nail down one key term you're going to hear: fiscal deficit. Honestly, the easiest way to think about it is like your own household budget. It's simply the gap between what the government earns and what it spends in a year. And just like if you spend more than you earn, that gap has to be filled by borrowing money. So the big goal for any government is to keep that borrowing, that deficit, under control. And as you can see from this chart, the trend is heading in the right direction, down. We're looking at a path of what they call fiscal prudence. The deficit is projected to drop just a bit, from 4.4% of GDP down to 4.3%. The bottom line is simple. The plan is to borrow less. So what are the actual figures we're talking about? Well, on the income side of the equation, the money coming in, the government expects to collect about 36.5 lakh crore rupees. This is from taxes and all the other ways it makes money without borrowing. And on the other side of the ledger, the spending side, the total planned expenditure,
for all those programs we just talked about and everything else is estimated to be 53.5 lakh crore rupees.
So you do the math, right? The difference between that spending and the income is the shortfall. And to cover it, the plan is to borrow about 11.7 lakh crore rupees from the market. That is the number that gets us to that 4.3% fiscal deficit figure we saw just a moment ago. See how it all connects?
Okay, we've looked at industries, we've looked at the national balance sheet. For this last part, let's bring it right back down to you. Let's talk about what this budget means for your wallet and some changes that are designed to make tax time, well, a little less painful.
Now, this first one is a biggie, especially if you like to travel. You know that tax they collect up front on overseas tour packages, the TCS? Well, it used to be as high as 20%. That is getting slashed all the way down to a flat, simple 2%. That's a huge, straightforward tax cut that's going to leave a lot more cash in your pocket when you book a trip.
The budget is also opening up a special one-time window for people who might need to sort out their foreign asset disclosures. It's basically a chance to come clean, and it's broken down into two very clear situations. First, if you just straight up didn't disclose something and it's worth up to 1 crore, you can pay the tax you owe plus an extra bit, and in return you get immunity from prosecution. But let's say it was a smaller mistake. Maybe you declared the income but just forgot to list the asset itself. For that, there's a much simpler path. You pay a flat fee, and you get immunity from all the penalties and legal trouble. It's all about simplifying and resolving old issues. And there's a whole bunch of other tweaks aimed at making life easier for the average taxpayer. Think about that frantic last-minute rush to file your taxes. Well, they're introducing things like more time to revise your return and staggering the deadlines to help ease that pressure. They're also softening the blow for small mistakes with simpler TDS rules and even decriminalizing minor slip-ups. The whole goal seems to be cutting down on the complexity and the back-and-forth legal battles. So there you have it. When you boil it all down, the 2026 budget feels like it's trying to do two things at once. On one hand, you have this incredibly specific, targeted support for certain industries. And on the other, you have these broad moves to simplify the rules for everybody, especially with taxes. But of course, the big question remains, will this two-pronged approach, this mix of precision strikes and broad simplification, be enough to really tackle the huge challenges of growth and prosperity for all? I guess only time will tell. Thanks for tuning in to this breakdown.